جريد 8 ازيكم؟ طبعا عندكم امتحان يوم الاثنين على الهاي ليفل. تمام، فتعالى كده مع بعض النهارده كده هحط لكم الفايل او البي دي اف ده على الجروب. تمام، علشان نقرا الستوري تشابتر 1. القصه بتاعتك اسمها جين اير. طبعا جين اير الروايه دي او القصه دي اتعملت افلام كتير. تمام، ممكن لو عملت سيرش على يوتيوب هتشوف كذا فيلم ليها، بس طبعا بأحداث مختلفة، بس المضمون واحد يعني. فأنا أفضل طبعا إن احنا نلتزم بالنسخة اللي هي بتاعة الدراسة، عشان في الأفلام والكلام ده بيبقى فيها أحداث زيادة. تعال نقرا كده القصة بتاعتنا. طبعا هما الترم الأول متقسم على 3 chapters، فنشوف كده الشابتر الأولاني نقرا مع بعض ونفهم أحداث القصة. أهم حاجة عندي في الستوري إن أنا أفهم الأحداث. لو ساعدتك فهمت أحداث القصة خلاص بالنسبة لك أي سؤال هتعرف تجيبه. تعال نقرا مع بعض. هنا بيقول لي My name is Jane Eyre and this is the story of my life. دي قصة حياتي. In 1818 في سنة 1818 when I was 2 years old لما كان عندي سنتين my parents died. بابا وماما توفوا. I want to live with Mr. Reed who was my mother's brother. راحت تعيش مع واحد اسمه مستر ريد اللي هو خالها يعني at Gateshead Hall. يبقى هي راحت تعيش مع خالها في Gateshead Hall. Sadly, Mr. Reed died some years later. بعدها بكم سنة خالها مات. But I continued to live there with his wife and her 3 children. طبعا عارفين طبعا هي عاشت كملت تعيش هناك مع مرات خالها وولادها التلاتة. طبعا عارفين بقى ان هي هتعملها معاملة وحشة والولاد هيتنمروا عليها وهكذا. مين التلات ولاد؟ Elza, John and Georgina. The 3 children hated me. They said that I was only a poor relation. هما بيقولوا بس ان انا قريبتهم الفقير. One afternoon when I was 9 years old لما كان عندي 9 سنين I was reading quietly in a window seat. قاعدة كده جنب الشباك. My cousin John rushed into the room and started to scream at me. بدأ يزعقلي. You have no right to read our books. مالكيش حق ان انت تقري من الكتب بتاعتنا. He said. You have no money and we have to feed and clothe you. انت معكيش فلوس واحنا مضطرين ان احنا نأكلك ونلبسك. Don't touch our books. ما تلمسيش الكتب بتاعتنا. Then he knocked the book out of my hand. اخذ مني الكتاب and started pulling my hair. وبدأ يتنمر على شعري. I screamed at him and tried to get free. حاولت اتخلص منه. At that moment في هذه اللحظة Mrs. Reed اللي هي مين؟ مرات خالها came into the room. دخلت الأوضة. You bad girl Jane. انت فتاة سيئة يا جين. She said and told Bessie. مين بيسي دي؟ One of the servants. واحدة من الخدمات ودي كانت الوحيدة الطيبة مع جين. To lock me in a room upstairs. إنها تحبسني في أوضة فوق. So I was thrown into the room. اترميت في الأوضة. The door was locked. الباب اتقفل. And I was left alone. يعني سابوني لوحدي. The room was cold, large and silent. Although it was well furnished. يعني كانت مفروشة كويس بس هي كانت طبعا ساقعة وكبيرة وساكتة. It was hardly ever used. الأوضة دي كان نادرا ما بيستخدموها. My uncle Mr. Reed عمي أو خالي اللي هو Mr. Reed had died in this room. كان ميت في الأوضة دي. What a kind man he had been. كان راجل طيب أول حاجة ده. But his wife was just the opposite. بس مرات خالي العكس تماما. يعني معنى كده إن مرات خالها ما كانتش كويسة. She had disliked me from the day that I arrived at Gateshead. كانت بتكرهني من أول يوم وصولي إلى Gateshead Hall. And had always made my life miserable. ودايما كانت مخلية حياتي بائسة. How long would Mrs. Reed make me stay in this room? يا ترى هتفضل مقعداني في الأوضة دي لحد إمتى؟ It soon got dark and there were no candles. طبعا زمان ما كانش فيه كهرباء فمفيش. هي بتقولك it soon get dark الدنيا هتضلم ومفيش candles. I was cold. كنت سقعانة and I was frightened. I became so terrified that I started to scream and kick the door. كنت خايفة طبعا، الدنيا ضلمة وميت فيها واحد قبل كده. بدأت تسمع أصوات، تمام، صوت الرياح وكده، فبدأت تصرخ kick the door. Pissy was a kind girl. So when she heard the noise، لما سمعت التخبيط اللي أنا عمال بخبطه، she opened the door. Please let me out, I cried. أنا قعدت أعيط وأقول لها please let me out. Just then Mrs. Reed appeared at the door. Mrs. Reed ظهرت على الباب. She looked at me with hate in her eyes. بصت لي كده بصة يعني شذرا كده. What is going on? She asked Pissy. Miss Jane was screaming, the young girl explained. Pissy قالت لها إن Miss Jane كانت بتصرخ. قالت لها rubbish، زبالة، أنت حيوانة. It was just a trick، دي خدعة يا هبلة، to get out، عشان تخرج. Look here again at once. قالت لها احبسيها تاني على طول. So Pissy had to push me back into the room. دخلتني تاني في الأوضة and locked the door once again. وقفلت الباب تاني. When I woke up the next morning I found myself in my own bed. لما صحيت تاني يوم طبعا أنا وقعت أغمى عليا، ويعني زي ما تقول كده لما صحت لقيت نفسها على السرير. A man was standing next to the bed. وفي واحد واقف جنبها and looking at me. I was pleased to note that the visitor was from outside, not someone from Gateshead Hall. مين بقى الأخ اللي كان واقف جنب السرير ده؟ It was Mr. Lloyd, a chemist اللي هو كيميائي أو صيدلي from the village من القرية. Mr. Lloyd looked at me kindly and asked me what had happened. إيه اللي حصل لك يا حلوة؟ I told him how unhappy I was with my aunt and cousins. قلت له قد إيه أنا كنت يعني عايشة حياة بائسة مع مرات خالي وعيالها. Would you like to go away to school؟ فمستر لويد اقترح لها تحبي تروحي مدرسة بعيد عنهم؟ قالت له I'll be very happy to leave Gateshead Hall. I told him well in that case، في هذه الحالة كيمست ده بيرد عليها لو مستر لويد I shall speak to Mrs. Reed and we will see what can we be done. وهنشوف اللي ممكن يتعمل. And with these words Mr. Lloyd left the room and went downstairs. Several weeks passed. عدت أسابيع شوية. I did not see Mr. Lloyd again. ما شفتش Mr. Lloyd تاني. And Mrs. Reed didn't say anything about school. مرت خالها ما قالتلاش أي حاجة عن السكول، يبقى هي أكيد ما كلمتهاش أو هو كلمها مثلا وهي رفضت. Then one day في يوم من الأيام my aunt called me to the breakfast room. نادتني مرات خالي عشان there was a man with her. كان في راجل معاها. She told me that his name was Mr. Brocklehurst and that he was the owner of lower school. Mr. Brocklehurst looked hard at me. بص لي كده بصة صعبة. She's rather small، صغيرة جدا. He said, Mrs. Reed, how old is she؟ عندها كم سنة؟ قلت لها 10 years old. فسأل جين قال لها Are you a good girl؟ هل أنت بنت كويسة؟ He asked me directly. وجه لي السؤال. It was impossible for me to answer this question with Mrs. Reed there. طبعا كان مستحيل بالنسبة لي إن أنا أرد على سؤال زي ده ومرات خالي واقفة قدامي. I remained silent. فضلت ساكتة. Jane is not a good girl, Mr. Brocklehurst. لا هي مش كويسة Mr. Brocklehurst, said Mrs. Reed. She's wicked and dishonest. هي طبعا غير أمينة وغريبة الأطوار. I hope that the teacher at Lowood will watch her very carefully. أنا عايزك بس تراقبها والمدرسين يخلوا بالهم منها. One morning in January 1826 I left Gateshead Hall for the last time. سبت البيت ده لآخر مرة. Only Pissy came to see me off on the couch. الوحيدة اللي جت تودعني مين؟ كانت Pissy. It was a long time before I saw my aunt or cousins again. The journey to Lowood took most of the day. الرحلة لحد المدرسة خدت طبعا أغلبية اليوم. It was almost dark when I finally reached the school. كانت الدنيا بتليل وأنا عبال ما وصلت المدرسة. A servant showed me into a large room. دخلوني في large room. Soon 2 women came in. في 2 ستات دخلوا علينا. One of them was Miss Temple, the headmistress. The headmistress اللي هي مديرة المكان. I liked her immediately. حبيتها على طول. The other was teacher Miss Miller. المدرسة اللي اسمها Miss Miller. Did you travel alone? Miss Temple asked me. قالت لها أنت مسافرة لوحدك. Is this the first time that you have left your parents? ده أول مرة تسيبي فيها باباك ومامتك. I told her that I had no parents. أنا بابايا ومامتي متوفيين ما عنديش parents. Miss Temple touched my cheek gently. طبطبت كده عليها على خدودها. This child is very tired, she said to other woman, but she's hungry too. بس هي أكيد جعانة. Please take her to the dining room. خديها إلى غرفة الطعام. Miss Miller. يا Miss Miller. The teacher took me along a corridor to a large room where about 80 girls were doing school work. خدتني الأوضة كبيرة كده. تمام. كان في حوالي 80 بنت قاعدين بيعملوا الهوم ورك بتاعهم. Put away your books, girls. حطوا كتبكم على جنب يا بنات. said Miss Miller. And bring the super trays. كل واحد يجيب الصواني بتاعته. And after a miserable meal. بعد وجبة فظيعة سيئة جدا of plain biscuits. plain biscuits يعني بسكوت سادة and water. تخيل بيتعشوا بسكوت سادة ومية. We all went upstairs to bed. تعالى كده نقرا مع بعض. انت قريت كده خلاص الستوري وعرفت الأحداث بتاعتها. مجرد ما هتقرا الأسئلة هتلاقي نفسك بتعرف تحلها. Who is the narrator of the story? مين اللي بيحكي القصة؟ ها؟ طبعا دي مين؟ Jane Eyre. How old was Jane when her parents died? ها؟ كان عندها كم سنة؟ كانت was a 2 years old. Who did Jane live with after her parents died and where? كانت عايشة مع مين بعد باباها وماماها ماتت؟ She lived with her mother's brother أو ممكن أقول her uncle Mr. Reed at Gateshead Hall. طبعا مش لازم تلتزم بالإجابة اللي مكتوبة دي. ساعتك ممكن تكتب بأسلوبك. When did Jane go to live with her uncle Mr. Reed? Her mother's brother. ها إمتى؟ قالك when she was 2 after the death of her parents. بعد ما وفاة باباها ومامتها. Where did the Reed family live? كانوا عايشين فين؟ They lived at Gateshead Hall. كل الأسئلة دي طبعا هو يعتبر سؤال أو سؤالين مكررين بطريقة مختلفة. Who did she live with after the death of her uncle? بعد ما عمها مات عاشت مع مين؟ Was her aunt Mrs. Reed and her 3 cousins اللي هم 3 children اللي هم Elsa, John and Georgina. Was Mrs. Reed kind to Jer? لا طبعا ما كانتش kind معه. Like her uncle? Explain according to Jane. اشرح لنا الموضوع ده عن طريق جين من وجهة نظر جين يعني. What kind of people were Mr. Reed and Mrs. Reed? لا no she wasn't. Mr. Reed was a kind man. عمي كان أو خالي كان راجل طيب. While Mrs. Reed was the opposite. كانت سيئة عكسه تماما. She disliked Jane from the day Jane arrived at Gateshead Hall. تكره جين من أول يوم هي وصلت فيه and she had always made her life miserable. خلت حياتها بائسة. How did Jane cousins feel towards or treats her? إزاي كانوا بيعاملوها؟ They hated her. كانوا بيكرهوها and said she was only a poor relation. وكانوا بيقولوا عليها إنه بس يدوب إيه واحدة قريبتنا فقيرة. What did John Reed tell Jane when he was her reading one of his books? He told her that قال لها she had no right to read their books. ما لهاش حق تقرأ من الكتب. She had no money and they had to feed and clothe her. He asked her also not to touch their books. وطلب منها إنه ما تلمسش الكتب. What did John do when he saw Jane Eyre reading one of his books? He knocked the box out of her hand and started pulling her hair. وبدأ يتريق على شعرها. What was Jane's reaction when John Reed pulled her hair? She screamed at him and tried to get free. How was Jane punished for reading the book? إزاي اتعاقبت لما كانت بتقرا كتاب and screaming at John? She was locked in a room and left alone. اتحبست في الأوضة وسابوها لوحدها. What room was Jane locked in? إيه الأوضة اللي جين اتحبست فيها؟ She was locked in the room where her uncle Reed died. الأوضة اللي مات فيها عمها. It was large cold silent room. It was hardly ever used. ونادرا ما كانوا بيستخدموه. How did Jane feel in the room where she was locked? Like there were no candles. ما كانش فيه شموع and it was dark. Jane was cold and frightened. كانت خايفة وسقعانة. She became so terrified that she started to scream and kick the door. بدأت تصرخ وتخبط في الباب. What happened to Jane after Pissy pushed her back in the room again? She fainted. يعني fainted يعني أغمى عليها and she remembered nothing. ما كانتش فاكرة أي حاجة. When she woke up لما صحت the next morning she found Mr. Lloyd looking at her. لقيت Mr. Lloyd قاعد إيه باصص لها. Who was Pissy? مين Pissy دي بقى؟ قال Pissy one of the servant. كانت واحدة من الخدامين. She was a kind girl. She opened the door when she heard Jane screaming. لما يسألني يقول لي who was Mr. Lloyd? أو how did Jane feel when he found a man not from Gateshead Hall standing next to the bed? He was a chemist from the village. ده كان صيدلي من القرية. He was the man that Jane saw when he opened her eyes after she had fainted. ده كان الراجل اللي شافته بعد ما فاقت من الإغماء يعني من حالة الإغماء. She was pleased when she saw him. وكانت فرحانة إنها شافته. How long did Jane spend at Gateshead Hall? She spent 8 years. فضلت فيها 8 سنوات. Her parents died when she was 2 and left to lower school when she was 10. يعني هي جت لما كان عندها 2 لما بابا ومامتها ماتوا ومشت تروح المدرسة لما بقى عندها 10 سنين. Who was waiting with Mrs. Reed in the breakfast room? Mr. Brocklehurst. Mr. Brocklehurst, the owner of lower school. هو مدير أو صاحب المدرسة. Who was Mr. Brocklehurst? What do you know about Mr. Brocklehurst? He was the owner or manager of lower school. He controlled and directed everything. هو اللي يعني بيدير كل حاجة in the school. His mother, Naomi Brocklehurst, built most of the school. He went to Garris Hall to take Jane to his school. What did Mrs. Reed tell Mr. Brocklehurst about Jane? She told him that a little she wasn't a good girl. She was weak and dishonest. She wanted the teacher of lower school to watch her carefully. يراقبوها كويس. When did Jane leave for lower school? مشت إمتى? One morning in January 1826 when she was 10. لما كان عندها 10 سنين. Only Bessie came to see her off. هي وحيدة بس Bessie اللي جت تودعها. Who was the only person who saw Jane off? mean Bessie. How long did the journey take from Gateshead Hall to lower school? قالك it took almost of the day. طبعا خد بالك هنا الإجابة مكتوبة بالتفصيل. ساعتك انت ممكن تديني إجابة مختصرة. ده مسموح في الستوري عادي. Who did Jane meet when she arrived at Lowood? قابلت مين؟ She met Miss Temple, the headmistress, and Mrs. Miller, a teacher of Lowood. Where did Miss Miller take Jane? أخذت جين فين on her first night at a school? في أول يوم ليها في المدرسة. She took her to a large room where about 80 girls were doing schoolwork. How many girls? لسه قايلينها 80 girls. What was Jane's first meal? الوجبة الأولانية إيه؟ Plain biscuits and water. تعال بقى نشوف الكوتيشنز. ايه هي مستر الكوتيشنز؟ يعني دي بيجيب لك كده اقتباس من الستوري، تمام، وتقول مين اللي قال لمين والموقف كان ايه. زي مثلا تعال هنا اهو. You have no right to read our books. اعمل لي عليها كومنت. You have no money and we have to feed and clothe you. Don't touch our books. مين اللي قال الكلام ده؟ جين ريد. لمين؟ لجين اير. خلاص. When he found her reading a book of theirs in a window seat, he pulled her hair and said that she had no money and they have to feed and clothe her. طبعا أنا بشرح الكلام بس اللي فوق أو أكتبه بصيغة تانية، تمام، أو أحكي الموقف. Please leave me out. مين اللي قال كده؟ جينير كان بيتكلم لبيسي. When she was locked in the room, when it got dark and there were no candles, Jane became frightened inside the room and said these words to her. Rubbish! It was just a trick to get out. انت حمار انت. دي خدعة عشان تطلع. مين اللي قال كده؟ Mrs. Reed لبيسي. When Bessie opened the door، أنا حتى هقول من دماغي مش هقرأ الكلام المكتوب. When Bessie opened the door, when Jane Eyre screamed at night. Would you like to go away to school؟ تحب تروح المدرسة؟ من اللي قال كده؟ Mr. Light طبعا لمين؟ لجين. When he came to see her after she had fainted, Jane said that she would be very happy to leave this house. Well, in that case, I shall speak to Mrs. Reed and we will see what can be done. مين اللي قال الكلام ده؟ That Mr. Lloyd said these words kindly to Jane when she said that she would be happy to leave Gateshead Hall. She's rather small. How old is she? مين اللي قال الكلام ده؟ طبعا ده Mr. Brocklehurst said these words to Mrs. Reed about Jane when he saw her for the first time. Are you a good girl? مين اللي قال السؤال السخيف ده؟ Mr. Brocklehurst asked that question to Jane, but Jane couldn't answer in the presence of Mrs. Reed. ما عرفتش تجاوب عليه قدام Mrs. Reed. She's wicked and dishonest. I hope that the teacher at Lower will watch her very carefully. مين اللي قالت الكلام ده؟ طبعا Mrs. Reed كانت بتتكلم مع مين؟ Mr. Brocklehurst about about Jane when he saw her for the first time. Did you travel alone the first time that you have left your parents? اللي قال الكلام طبعا كانت Miss Temple asked this question to Jane and told her that Jane طبعا قالت لها that she had no parents. Questions to Jane when she arrived at Lowood School. Jane told her that she had no parents. The child is very tired but she's very hungry too. من اللي قال كده؟ Mrs. Temple كانت بتكلم مين؟ Mrs. Miller. She asked her to take Jane when she arrived at Lowood School. Mrs. Temple was so kind so Jane loved her immediately. عشان كده جين حبتها على طول. Put away your box and bring the super trays. من اللي قال كده؟ Miss Miller said these words to the girls at school. When supper time came, the food was a miserable meal. طبعا كانت وجبة منيلة ب60 نيلة of plain biscuits and water. كده تقريبا يا أولاد خلصنا الجزء الأولاني بتاع الستوري. مجرد بس ما أنت تقراها ممكن تسمع الفيديو ده هتعرف تحل أي سؤال إن شاء الله. شكرا وأشوفكم في فيديو تاني بإذن الله. باي.